The alarm on the sparring floor had not even finished ringing when I felt my heart skip in a way they had not skipped in 300 years of teaching. I am Vex Shakur, Senior Combat Instructor of the Concord Blade Masters, and I have watched every species in known space pick up a weapon for the first time. I know the shake in a new recruit's wrist before they know it themselves. I know the exact moment fear turns into instinct. What I did not know, what nothing in my long life had prepared me for, was a small human girl walking onto my floor and lifting two blades at once, one in each hand, as if the very idea of choosing a side had never occurred to her. Her name was Mira Callahan. She had arrived with the newest batch of human recruits only 6 days earlier, and until that moment, she had said almost nothing in any of my classes. She sat in the back row. She watched. She did not ask questions the way the other recruits did, the ones desperate to prove themselves worthy of a seat among older, stronger, faster species. I remember thinking she looked tired, maybe even a little bored, and I remember deciding that boredom on a combat floor usually means someone is about to be embarrassed. The Concord has one rule that every cadet learns before they learn how to stand properly with a blade. We call it the law of one blade. It is not a suggestion. It is not a tradition passed down out of habit. It is carved into the training manuals of over 400 member species, and it has never once been broken in recorded history. No sapient mind, regardless of shape or number of limbs, can command two weapons independently at the same time. One side of the brain always wins. One hand always leads, and the other always follows a half step behind, mirroring, copying, never truly separate. Try to fight with a blade in each hand, and you do not become twice as dangerous. You become half as dangerous twice over, distracted, divided, and dead within the first exchange. I have seen the proof of this rule myself, more times than I can count. I trained a drailing war captain, my own cousin, who tried to dual wield during a friendly exhibition 30 years ago. He was one of the finest one-handed fighters I had ever seen, fast, precise, deadly. The moment he added a second blade, his footwork collapsed. His timing fell apart. He was disarmed in under 4 seconds by an opponent half his rank. He never tried it again. Nobody tries it twice. The body simply will not allow it, no matter how strong the will behind it. So when I called the newest human recruits onto the floor that morning, I was not expecting anything unusual. I had run this same introductory trial 1,000 times before. New species arrive, nervous and eager, and I let them spar lightly against a Concord training partner so I can measure their instincts before real lessons begin. It tells me how they move, how they breathe under pressure, whether their species leans toward speed or strength or patience. Humans, from what little I had seen of them so far, leaned toward none of these in any remarkable way. They were slower than a Khaleesi, weaker than a drailing, worse at reading an opponent's stance than almost anyone else in the recruitment hall. Frankly, I had already begun to wonder what use the Concord saw in bringing humanity into the fold at all. I called the first pair of names. A young man named Oliver Finch stepped up first, holding his practice blade the way I had taught him 2 days earlier, both hands wrapped around the same hilt for balance and control. That, at least, made sense to me. That was the shape of every fighter I had ever trained. Oliver lost his match within a minute, but he lost it well, with proper footwork and a respectable guard, and I marked him down as promising. Then I called Mira Callahan. She stood up from the back row, without any of the nervous energy the other recruits carried. She walked to the weapon rack the way someone walks toward a shelf to pick out a book, unhurried, almost thoughtless. And then, in front of the entire training hall, she reached out with both hands at once and lifted 2 practice sabers, one in her left grip and one in her right, and turned to face her opponent as if this were the most ordinary thing in the world. The hall went quiet. I do not mean quiet in the way a room goes quiet when people are simply paying attention. I mean the specific, heavy silence that settles over a room full of trained fighters who have just watched someone break a law of nature without seeming to notice they had done it. I stepped forward immediately. Every instructor is trained to correct dangerous mistakes before they cause harm, And in my professional opinion, in that exact moment, this was a mistake waiting to happen. I told her, politely but firmly, that dual wielding was not permitted during introductory trials, not because of any written rule against it, but because no student in Concord history had ever been able to use two weapons safely. I told her that within the first exchange, her attention would split, her rhythm would break, and she would likely injure herself far more than any opponent could injure her. She looked at me with an expression I still cannot fully describe. It was not defiance, it was not confusion, it was something closer to polite disagreement, the kind of look someone gives you when they know you have simply never seen the thing they are about to show you. She said, quite calmly, that she had been doing this since she was a child, and that she would be fine. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because pretending otherwise would dishonor the story that followed. What I felt was irritation. I have trained soldiers for 3 centuries. I have watched species evolve, adapt, and grow into some of the finest warriors in the galaxy. I did not appreciate being told, calmly and without hesitation, by a recruit barely out of her own species' childhood, that a law older than most civilizations in the Concord simply did not apply to her. But I also understood something about my role as an instructor. Sometimes the fastest way to teach a lesson is to let a mistake happen safely, in a controlled environment, where the cost of being wrong is nothing more than a bruised pride and a quick trip to the healing bay. So against my better judgment, and with a small, satisfied certainty that I was about to watch a very short and very educational lesson unfold, I allowed the match to continue. Her opponent was a Khaleesi recruit named Sorel, tall, fast, and already one of the strongest fighters in the new intake. Khaleesi warriors are known across the Concord for their reaction speed. Their nervous systems process movement almost twice as fast as most other species, which makes them extremely difficult to surprise. If anyone was going to expose the flaw in Mira's approach within the first 2 seconds, it would be Sorel. I raised my hand to signal the start of the match, already composing in my mind the gentle correction I would offer afterward, the kind of feedback meant to soften disappointment without damaging confidence. I have given that same speech to hundreds of overconfident recruits over the years. I did not expect to need a new one. I dropped my hand. The whistle sounded, sharp and clean across the hall, and for one full breath, nothing happened. Mira did not rush forward the way most new fighters do out of nervous energy. She did not hesitate the way frightened recruits often do either. She simply shifted her weight, calm and unbothered, both blades held loose and low, as if she were waiting for a question rather than a fight. Sorel moved first, as I expected. A quick testing strike, low and controlled, meant to measure Mira's reaction time before committing to anything serious. It is the kind of opening move I teach every new student because it reveals so much about an opponent without risking too much in return. What happened next is the reason I am telling this story at all. Mira's left blade rose to meet the strike, smooth and unhurried, exactly the kind of block I would expect from any properly trained fighter holding a single weapon. That part made sense. That part fit everything I understood about combat and about her species. It was her right hand that broke something inside my understanding of the universe. While her left blade was still rising to block, her right blade was already moving in a completely different direction, on a completely different rhythm, as if it belonged to another person entirely. It was not mirroring the left hand. It was not lagging a half step behind the way every dual-wielding failure I had ever witnessed had lagged. It moved independently, on its own timing, its own purpose, as though 2 separate minds were sharing one body and had simply agreed, without argument, to work together. Sorel adjusted instantly, pulling back to avoid the second blade, but the adjustment cost time, and time is the one thing no fighter can afford to lose against someone who does not need to think about where their next movement is coming from. Mira's footwork shifted with the same easy calm she had shown before the match even began, and within 4 exchanges that should have been impossible for anyone attempting to control 2 weapons at once, Sorel's own blade was knocked from their grip and skittered across the floor. The hall stayed silent for a long moment afterward. I do not think anyone quite believed what they had just watched, myself included. I had spent 300 years teaching soldiers that this could not be done, and I had just watched it happen in front of me, in less time than it takes to properly explain the rule I had built my entire career around. Mira lowered both blades, glanced at Sorel with something close to sympathy, and said that it was a good match. Then she walked back to her seat in the back row, sat down, and waited for the next pairing to be called, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. I stood there on the training floor, holding my clipboard, staring at the space where the fight had just taken place, and I felt something I had not felt in longer than I could remember. It was not simply surprise. Surprise fades quickly for someone who has lived as long as I have. What I felt was closer to fear, the quiet, professional kind of fear that comes from realizing you may have misunderstood something fundamental about the galaxy you thought you knew. I looked down at my notes, at the neat little box where I had already written the word promising beside Oliver Finch's name, and I found myself unable to write anything at all beside Mira Callahan's. There was no box on my evaluation sheet for what I had just witnessed. There was no category, no rating, no polite phrase I could use to describe a recruit who had just broken a law of combat physics as casually as someone stretching before a morning walk. I thought back, standing there, to the day I first accepted the rank of senior instructor. I had been young then, barely past my own combat trials, and the officer who trained me had told me that the law of one blade was the single most important lesson I would ever teach. She had said that every other lesson, footwork, timing, distance, breathing under pressure, could be adjusted and refined over a soldier's lifetime. But the law of one blade was different. It was not a technique to be improved. It was a boundary to be respected, the same way a sailor respects the depth of the ocean rather than trying to breathe beneath it. I had carried that lesson with me for 3 centuries, teaching it to every species that passed through my hall, and I had never once had reason to question it, because every species that passed through my hall had proven it true, again and again, without exception. Watching Mira return calmly to her seat, I realized that my entire career had rested on an assumption I never knew I was making. I had assumed that because the rule held true for every species I had ever met, it must hold true for every species that could ever exist. It had never once occurred to me that the boundary I had spent 3 centuries respecting might simply be the shape of every mind I had happened to encounter, rather than the shape of minds in general. It is a strange and uncomfortable thing, discovering that a wall you have spent your entire life walking beside was never load-bearing at all. The other recruits in the hall had begun to whisper among themselves, glancing between Mira and the empty space where Sorel's fallen blade still lay. Some of them looked excited, the way young soldiers often look when they witness something unexpected and thrilling. Others looked uneasy, the same unease I imagine crosses the mind of any trained fighter who suddenly realizes the rules they have built their confidence upon might not be as solid as they once believed. With every eye in the room still fixed on the small human girl sitting calmly in the back row, I decided that before this trial ended, before I filed any report or made any recommendation to the Concord Council, I needed to speak with her privately. Not as an instructor correcting a mistake, not as an officer filing a warning. I needed to understand, as clearly and honestly as I could, exactly what I had just seen, and exactly what it might mean for everything I thought I understood about the limits of a sapient mind. Because if one human girl could do this without any special training, without any forbidden technology, without any explanation beyond a calm shrug and a quiet claim that she had been doing this since childhood, then the law of one blade was not a law at all. It was simply a limit that every other species in the Concord happened to share, and humanity, for reasons I could not yet begin to guess, had never learned to accept it. I requested a private meeting with Mira Callahan before the evening bell, and I requested it in a tone that left no room for polite refusal. She agreed without hesitation, which surprised me almost as much as the match itself had. Most recruits, when summoned by a senior instructor after doing something unusual, arrive nervous, unsure whether they are about to be praised or punished. Mira arrived looking exactly the way she had looked all week, calm, quiet, mildly curious about what I wanted to discuss. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I asked her directly whether she was using any form of neural enhancement, band stimulant, or hidden augmentation to achieve what I had witnessed on the training floor. It was not an accusation. It was a genuine question, because in 300 years of teaching, the only times I had ever seen anything resembling true dual wielding involved illegal technology, dangerous surgical modification, or some combination of both. Every one of those cases ended badly for the fighter involved. The brain was never meant to run two independent combat sequences at once, and forcing it to do so through artificial means always came with a cost: exhaustion, seizures, sometimes permanent damage. Mira shook her head and told me, quite plainly, that she had never used anything like that in her life. She said the idea of needing an implant to move both hands differently sounded strange to her, the same way it might sound strange to me if someone asked whether I needed a special device to breathe. I did not believe her at first. I want to be honest about that. I have caught recruits lying about band enhancements before, and the lie usually sounds exactly like the calm, simple denial she gave me. I asked her to explain, in detail, how she had learned to move two blades on two separate rhythms without any training program, any implant, any secret technique passed down through some hidden human tradition of warfare. What she told me next took nearly an hour, and by the end of it, I understood far less about humanity than I had believed I understood at the start of the conversation, even though every single thing she described sounded, by her account, completely ordinary. She began by telling me about something called a drum kit. She said that as a child, long before she had ever picked up a weapon of any kind, she had spent several years learning to play music, using both hands and both feet at once, each limb performing a different pattern, a different rhythm, all four moving independently, while somehow producing something that sounded whole rather than broken. She said it took time to learn, the way any skill takes time, but that by the time she was old enough to attend school, she no longer had to think about it consciously at all. Her hands simply knew how to disagree with each other in a useful way. I asked her whether this was some kind of specialized military preparation, some early form of combat training disguised as art. She laughed, gently, and told me that no, it was simply something children on her world did for fun. Some played music. Some played games that required each hand to press different controls at different times, tracking separate patterns on a screen, while their mind held both sequences at once without confusion. She mentioned something called typing, where her fingers moved across dozens of small symbols, faster than her conscious mind could follow, each hand responsible for its own half of the motion, working together without ever needing to move in matching patterns. I sat there, trying to reconcile what she was describing with everything I understood about the limits of a sapient nervous system. In every species I had ever trained, from the fast reflexed Kaelisi to the powerful, deliberate Drailing, the two sides of the body were bound together by instinct. One side led, the other followed. It was not a flaw, it was simply how a mind that evolved to survive in a dangerous world learned to conserve its attention, focusing fully on one clear threat rather than dividing itself across two. Mira explained, without any sense of pride or superiority, that human children were surrounded from a very young age by activities that quietly trained the opposite habit. She mentioned something called jump rope, where two ropes turned in opposite directions at once, while a child's feet found a rhythm that belonged to neither rope exactly, but somehow answered both. She mentioned cooking, where one hand stirred a pot at a steady pace while the other chopped vegetables at a completely different pace, both actions happening at once without either interrupting the other. None of it, she insisted, was special. None of it was designed with combat in mind. It was simply how many human children spent ordinary afternoons without ever once thinking of themselves as training for anything at all. I asked her the question that had been sitting uncomfortably in the back of my mind since the match had ended. I asked her whether every human possessed this ability, or whether she herself was simply unusual even among her own people. She thought about that for a moment, longer than she had paused for anything else in our conversation, and told me honestly that she did not know for certain, but that she suspected many humans could do some version of what she had done on the training floor, even if most of them had never tried to apply it to fighting. She said her older brother had never picked up a weapon in his life, but he had spent years playing a musical instrument that required each hand to press different keys in different patterns, and she believed, if pressed, he could probably learn to fight the same way she did within a matter of weeks rather than years. That single sentence unsettled me more than the entire match had. A skilled warrior spending years mastering a rare and difficult technique was something I could understand and respect. It fit neatly into everything I knew about how mastery worked across every species in the Concord. But a technique that an untrained civilian could pick up within weeks, simply because of habits formed during childhood play, was something else entirely. It was not a skill, it was a foundation, quietly built into an entire population without any of them realizing what they were building. I asked her one final question before ending our meeting that evening. I asked her whether humans had any concept, any tradition, any teaching similar to our law of one blade, any belief that a mind could not safely command two independent actions at once. She said no. She said, as far as she knew, no human had ever needed such a rule, because no human had ever run into the wall the rule was meant to describe. She said it almost apologetically, the way someone might apologize for accidentally answering a difficult question too easily. Before ending the conversation, I asked her one more question, one that had been sitting quietly beneath all the others since the moment I first called her into my office. I asked her whether she had been afraid, even for a moment, when she picked up both blades in front of an unfamiliar species on an unfamiliar training floor, surrounded by fighters far stronger and far faster than herself. She considered the question carefully before answering, which told me it was not a question she had been asked very often. She said that fear, for her, came from uncertainty, from not knowing what her own body was capable of in a given moment. She said she had never felt uncertain about her hands. She trusted them the way she trusted her own eyes to see or her own lungs to breathe, without needing to understand the deeper mechanics behind the trust. What frightened her, if anything, was the idea of being told she could not do something her body had always known how to do, simply because no one else around her had ever tried it. That answer stayed with me long after she left my office. I found myself thinking about all the young Drailing and Khaleesi recruits I had trained over the centuries, brilliant, capable fighters who had never once considered dual-wielding a possibility worth attempting, not because they lacked the raw physical capacity, but because every teacher before me, and every teacher before them, had assured them with complete confidence that the attempt would end in failure. I wondered, uncomfortably, how many other abilities might exist quietly within other species, abilities no one had ever discovered, simply because no one had ever been told it was worth trying. I dismissed her from the meeting and sat alone in my quarters for a long while afterward, turning her words over in my mind. I thought about my cousin, the fine warrior who had failed so completely the moment he tried to hold a blade in each hand. I thought about every recruit I had ever trained, every species, every failed attempt at dual wielding I had personally witnessed across 3 centuries of service. Every single one of them had approached the problem the same way, treating both hands as extensions of a single intention, a single rhythm, because that was simply how their minds had always worked. Humans, it seemed, had never learned that particular limitation, because their ordinary lives had never given them a reason to accept it. They had spent generations, without any military purpose in mind, quietly teaching their children that 2 hands could hold 2 separate intentions at the same time and still work together toward the same goal. I began to wonder, sitting there in the dim light of my quarters, what else humanity might be capable of that the rest of the Concord had simply assumed was impossible, not because it truly was impossible, but because every other species had never had a reason to try. The following morning, I requested formal permission from the Concord Training Council to run an expanded trial, one involving a wider group of human recruits, chosen at random rather than selected for any prior combat talent. I wanted to know whether Mira Callahan was a rare exception among her own people, or whether I had simply witnessed the first quiet sign of something far larger than a single gifted fighter. Part of me, the part shaped by 300 years of confident teaching, hoped the answer would be that she was an exception. It would have been a comfortable answer, one that let the law of one blade remain intact for every species except a single unusual individual. Another part of me, a smaller part, that had grown quietly over the course of that single quiet conversation, already suspected the answer would be far less comfortable than that. I did not sleep well that night. I kept thinking about the calm, unbothered way she had lifted 2 blades at once, as though the very question of whether it was possible had never once occurred to her, because no one in her entire life had ever told her it could not be done. The council approved my request within a single day, which told me they were just as unsettled by my report as I had been by the match itself. Word of what had happened on the training floor had already spread through the instructor ranks by the time I arrived the next morning, and I found myself facing an unusual number of colleagues waiting near the entrance to the sparring hall, all of them pretending to have other reasons for being there. I had asked for 10 human recruits, chosen without any regard for prior combat experience, prior athletic ability, or any factor that might explain away the results as a matter of pure talent. I wanted ordinary people. I wanted cooks and clerks and students, the kind of humans who had never once considered themselves warriors, because if what Mira had shown me was truly a foundation built quietly into childhood rather than a rare personal gift, then it should appear, at least in some small form, in almost anyone. The first recruit called forward was a young man named Daniel Whitmore, who told me before the match even began that he had never held a weapon of any kind in his life. He worked, back on his homeworld, preparing meals in a large kitchen, and he seemed almost embarrassed to be standing on a Concord training floor at all. I asked him whether he could hold a blade in each hand and move them independently, the way Mira had. He looked at his own hands for a moment, flexed his fingers, and said he thought he probably could, though he had never tried it with anything sharper than a kitchen knife. I gave him 2 practice blades and a light opponent, a young drailing recruit still early in training, and told them both to move slowly, focusing on control rather than speed. What I saw in the next few minutes was not the same effortless mastery Mira had shown. Daniel's movements were clumsy, uncertain, clearly unpracticed, but when I watched closely, when I set aside my expectation of failure and simply observed what his hands were actually doing, I saw the same basic principle at work. His right hand moved to block, while his left hand, a half-second later, began an entirely separate motion of its own, not mirroring the right, not lagging behind it in the familiar way every other species lagged, but attempting, imperfectly, to act on its own. It was not skilled, it was not dangerous, but it was there, a rough, untrained version of the exact thing that should have been physically impossible according to every rule I had spent my career teaching. I called the next recruit forward, a woman named Grace Sutton, who told me she had spent years working as a typist before joining the Concord, spending long hours each day moving her fingers across rows of small symbols faster than most species could track individual letters. When I handed her 2 blades, her movements were noticeably steadier than Daniel's had been, though still far from Mira's calm mastery. Her hands did not move in perfect independence, but they moved with a kind of quiet confidence that suggested her fingers, at least, already understood something her conscious mind had never been asked to think about before. By the 4th recruit, I had stopped expecting failure entirely and started taking careful notes instead. A retired teacher named Edward Lowry, older than most of the other recruits and slower on his feet, struggled with footwork the way many older recruits from many species struggled, his legs no longer as quick as they once had been. But when I asked about his hands specifically, he mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he had spent much of his life directing a group of musicians, using each hand to guide entirely different sections at entirely different moments, sometimes slowing one side while speeding the other, all without ever losing track of the whole. When I gave him 2 blades, his hands moved with a strange, deliberate independence that had nothing to do with speed and everything to do with control, each blade following its own quiet logic while somehow still working toward the same purpose. I began to understand something as the trials continued through that long morning, something that unsettled me far more deeply than watching Mira's original match had. This was not about any single hidden talent. It was not about music, or typing, or cooking specifically. It was about an entire species that had spent generations, without any military purpose in mind, raising children inside a world full of small, ordinary activities that quietly taught 2 hands to hold 2 separate intentions at once. Some recruits were better at it than others, the way some recruits from any species show more natural aptitude for any given skill. But almost every human I tested that day showed at least some trace of the ability, some rough, untrained version of the thing that every other species in the Concord had spent centuries believing was simply beyond the reach of a sapient mind. Before Clara stepped forward, I tested a quiet, soft-spoken young man named Henry Aldridge, who told me he had spent much of his childhood learning to paint, one hand holding a brush steady while the other adjusted the angle of his canvas or mixed colors on a separate palette, each hand engaged in a task the other was not thinking about at all. His movements on the training floor were slow and careful, more like a dance than a fight, but when I studied his hands closely, I saw the same quiet independence I had seen in every volunteer before him, a small, untrained echo of something far greater waiting beneath the surface. I also tested a pair of siblings that morning, a brother and sister named Owen and Faye Prescott, who had grown up on a farm and spent years milking animals with one hand while repairing tools or sorting produce with the other, each hand occupied with an entirely separate rhythm of work for hours at a time. Neither of them had ever held a weapon before that day, and neither considered their upbringing in any way remarkable, yet both showed clear, measurable signs of the same underlying ability. Watching them spar awkwardly but genuinely against their assigned partners, I found myself struck by how ordinary their lives had been, and how extraordinary the result of that ordinary life now appeared on a Concord training floor. I called forward a young woman named Clara Bennett near the end of the trial, a competitive game player who had spent years, by her own account, controlling separate actions with each hand across dozens of different digital challenges, tracking multiple moving targets at once, her fingers responding to patterns her conscious thoughts could barely keep up with. When I handed her 2 blades, I watched something close to what I had seen from Mira herself, not quite as smooth, not quite as calm, but unmistakably real. Her left blade blocked while her right blade struck on an entirely separate rhythm, and for a brief, strange moment, I found myself watching 2 independent fighters sharing a single body, moving with a kind of coordinated disagreement that should not have been possible according to everything I had ever taught. By midday, word of the expanded trial had spread far beyond the instructor ranks. I began to notice senior officers from other departments quietly observing from the edges of the hall, some of them scholars from the Concord's own Combat Research Division, watching with expressions I recognized immediately, because I had likely worn the same expression myself only 2 days earlier. It was the particular look of someone watching a fact they had built their entire career upon quietly come apart in front of them. One of the scholars, an older Kalisi researcher named Faya Dross, approached me during a brief pause in the trials and asked whether I had considered the possibility that human physiology itself might be fundamentally different from every other species in the Concord, some hidden structure in the brain that allowed for this kind of division without the usual cost. I told her honestly that I did not know, and that the question felt far too large for a single instructor to answer alone. What I did know, from my conversation with Mira the night before, was that no human considered this ability special, rare, or even particularly interesting. It was simply how they had always lived, the same way breathing or walking required no special explanation. By the end of the day, I had tested 17 human recruits in total, far more than the 10 I had originally requested, because word of the trial had spread, and more volunteers kept arriving throughout the afternoon. Every single one of them showed some measurable trace of independent two-handed coordination, ranging from Daniel's clumsy, hesitant attempts to Clara's smooth, almost effortless control. None of them had trained specifically for combat. None of them had any hidden augmentation or forbidden technology. Every single one of them had simply grown up inside a culture that, without ever intending to, had quietly prepared them to break a law the rest of the galaxy had never thought to question. I remember standing at the edge of the training hall as the last recruit left for the evening, watching the empty floor where 17 ordinary humans had, one after another, done something that generations of Concord scholars had declared impossible. I thought about the confident lecture I had given new recruits only a week earlier, explaining the law of one blade as a settled and unquestionable fact of sapient neurology. I thought about how certain I had been, how completely I had believed it, because every species I had ever trained before humanity had proven it true without exception. I understood, standing there in the quiet hall, that the law of one blade had never truly been a law of the universe at all. It had only ever been a law of every species except one, a limit so deeply shared among every other member of the Concord that no one had ever thought to question whether it might simply be a boundary of habit rather than a boundary of possibility. Humanity, through nothing more remarkable than the ordinary business of growing up, had quietly stepped outside a wall the rest of us had never realized was optional. That night, I filed a full report to the Concord Training Council, recommending an immediate reassessment of combat doctrine across every branch of service. I did not yet know how deep the implications would run, or how many other assumptions about the galaxy's newest member species would need to be quietly and uncomfortably reconsidered in the months that followed. But I understood, even then, that something fundamental had shifted, and that the shift had begun with a single quiet human girl who had simply never been told that what she was doing should have been impossible. 3 weeks after my report reached the Concord Training Council, I found myself standing before a very different audience than the one I was used to. Instead of nervous new recruits waiting to spar, I faced a room full of senior officers, doctrine writers, and combat researchers from a dozen different member species, all of them gathered to witness what the Council had begun calling the human trials, a formal recorded series of tests meant to determine, once and for all, whether what I had observed was a temporary curiosity or a permanent shift in how the Concord understood the limits of a sapient mind. I stood at the front of the hall beside Mira Callahan, who had been asked to remain as a training consultant following her original match, a request she had accepted with the same quiet, unbothered calm she brought to everything else. In the weeks since our first conversation, she had become something between a curiosity and a colleague to me, someone I found myself consulting more often than I ever expected to consult a recruit, barely out of her own species' early adulthood. The Council had gathered a much larger group of human volunteers for this second round of trials, nearly 40 in total, drawn from different regions of their homeworld, different backgrounds, different ages. I had insisted on this diversity myself, because I no longer wanted to hear any argument that the earlier results had come from a narrow, unusual sample. If humanity truly carried this ability as a quiet, ordinary part of growing up, then it needed to appear across as wide a range of humans as we could gather, not just among the young, the athletic, or the naturally gifted. The first volunteer of the day was an older woman named Ellen Marsh, who told the assembled officers, with a note of amusement in her voice, that she had spent most of her working life managing accounts for a small trading business, and that she had never so much as touched a weapon before arriving at the Concord Recruitment Center. When I handed her 2 practice blades, several of the observing officers exchanged skeptical glances, clearly expecting nothing more than an awkward, embarrassing display. What they saw instead was slow, careful, but unmistakably present. Ellen's hands did not move quickly, and her footwork remained hesitant throughout the short exercise, but when I asked her afterward how she had managed to keep both blades moving on separate rhythms, she shrugged and said she had spent years balancing 2 separate columns of numbers in her head at once, one moving forward while the other moved backward, checking each against the other without ever losing track of either. She said it had never occurred to her that this had anything to do with fighting until I asked her to try. I began to notice, as the day continued, a pattern forming among the officers and researchers watching from the observation benches. Their skepticism, so confident and dismissive at the start of the morning, began to shift, quietly and visibly, into something closer to unease. Phaedros, the Kaelisi researcher who had questioned me weeks earlier, sat near the front of the hall taking rapid notes, her expression growing more troubled with each new volunteer who stepped onto the floor. A young man named Nathan Priestley, who told us he had spent his early years training as a competitive swimmer, demonstrated a version of the ability rooted not in music or typing, but in the separate, coordinated movement of arms and legs required to move efficiently through water, each limb performing its own task on its own timing while still working toward a single forward motion. A woman named Lucy Farrow, who had spent years working as a seamstress, showed a quieter, more precise version, her hands moving with the same careful independence she had once used to guide fabric and needle in two entirely different directions at once. By mid-afternoon, the council had gathered enough evidence to confirm what I had already suspected weeks earlier, though confirming it formally, in front of representatives from a dozen member species, carried a different weight than my earlier private report ever could. Nearly every human volunteer, regardless of age, background, or prior physical training, showed some measurable trace of independent two-handed coordination. The degree varied widely, from Ellen's slow, careful attempts to a young athlete named Harold Vance, who moved with a natural fluidity nearly as impressive as Mira's original match. But the underlying pattern held true across nearly every volunteer tested that day. Midway through the afternoon, a drailing officer named Korvax Thane, a decorated veteran with a reputation for blunt honesty, requested permission to test the ability himself against Mira directly. Not as a formal match, but as a personal demonstration meant to satisfy his own disbelief. The council granted the request, and I watched with quiet interest as Korvax, one of the finest single-blade fighters in the entire training division, stepped onto the floor across from a human girl barely a fraction of his size and experience. He did not attempt to dual-wield himself, wisely choosing to rely on the single-blade mastery that had earned him his reputation. Even so, the match ended almost exactly the way my own conversation with Cyril's defeat had ended months earlier, quickly, cleanly, and with an unmistakable sense among everyone watching that raw strength and years of experience meant very little against an opponent capable of attacking from two independent directions at once. Korvax removed himself from the floor afterward without complaint, though I noticed him remain by the observation benches for the rest of the afternoon, watching every subsequent match with the quiet, focused attention of a man rebuilding his entire understanding of combat from the ground up. During a brief recess in the trials, I overheard a conversation between two senior drailing officers that I have never forgotten. One of them, a battle commander with decades of field experience, asked the other, quietly and without any trace of his usual confidence, what this discovery might mean for every combat doctrine the Concord had built over the centuries. Doctrines that assumed, as a basic and unquestioned fact, that no opponent could ever fight effectively with two independent weapons at once. The other officer had no answer, only a long, uncomfortable silence. I understood their concern, because I shared it myself. The law of one blade was not simply a rule about how individual soldiers trained. It shaped how entire armies planned their formations, how defensive strategies accounted for an opponent's reach and reaction time, how weapons themselves were designed, built around the assumption that no fighter would ever need to defend against two separate points of attack, moving on two separate rhythms from a single opponent. If an entire species could reliably learn to do exactly that, and learn it not through years of specialized military training, but through the ordinary business of growing up, then a great deal of Concord military doctrine would need to be quietly and carefully rebuilt from its foundations. Late in the afternoon, the council called Mira forward once more, this time not to spar, but to speak directly to the assembled officers about her own experience. She stood at the front of the hall, calm as always, and answered their questions with the same simple honesty she had shown me during our very first conversation weeks earlier. When one of the researchers asked her directly whether she believed every human could learn to fight the way she did, she paused for a long moment before answering. She said she believed most humans carried the basic foundation for it already, quietly built into them through childhood, but that turning that foundation into true combat skill still required practice, discipline, and time, the same as it would for any other ability. She said the difference between her people and every other species in the Concord was not that humans were naturally more skilled or more gifted in battle, but that they had simply never been taught, at any point in their long history, that using both hands independently was something a mind could not safely do. Without that limiting belief, human children had simply grown up doing it in small, ordinary ways their entire lives, never realizing what they were quietly preparing themselves for. I found myself thinking, as she spoke, about how strange and humbling it was to realize that an entire species had accidentally trained itself towards something the rest of the galaxy considered impossible, not through ambition or design, but through nothing more remarkable than childhood games, kitchen chores, and quiet hours spent practicing music, or typing, or swimming. There had been no grand plan behind it, no ancient warrior tradition passed down through the generations. There had only been ordinary life, repeated countless times across an entire world, until the ability to divide one's attention between two independent tasks became simply another unremarkable part of being human. By the end of that long day, the Council had gathered enough evidence to convene an emergency session among the Concord's most senior military scholars, myself included, to begin the difficult work of reconsidering doctrine that had stood unchanged for centuries. I remember leaving the training hall that evening feeling a strange mixture of professional excitement and quiet unease, the same feeling, I suspect, that any scholar feels when a fact they once considered permanent begins, slowly and undeniably, to come apart in their hands. I looked back once before leaving the hall, at the empty sparring floor where dozens of ordinary humans had spent the day quietly rewriting a rule that had shaped Concord warfare since long before any of them had been born. I thought about how certain I had once been, only a few short weeks earlier, that the law of one blade was simply a fact of nature, as unchangeable as gravity or the passage of time. I understood now that it had never been a law at all. It had only ever been the shared limit of every species who had never met a human child at play. 6 months passed between the emergency council session and the day I found myself standing once more across from Mira Callahan on a training floor, though this time the roles between us had quietly shifted in ways neither of us could have predicted when we first met. I was no longer simply her instructor. I had become, through a series of requests I never expected to receive, her student in certain matters, and she had become something closer to a research partner in mine, as the two of us worked together to answer the question that had consumed the Concord's military scholars since the day her original match first exposed the truth about the law of one blade. The question was simple to state and had proven extraordinarily difficult to answer. Could the ability humans carried so naturally be taught, in any meaningful way, to other species who had never grown up with it woven quietly into their childhood? Or was it something too deeply rooted in early development, too dependent on a lifetime of small, unremarkable habits, to ever be transferred to a mind that had spent its entire existence believing, without question, that two hands could only ever move as one? The early results of our shared research had not been encouraging. I had spent the first 2 months of the project attempting to train a small group of volunteer officers, myself included, using methods inspired by everything Mira had described to me during our very first conversation. We practiced simple rhythm exercises, tapping different patterns with each hand, attempting to hold 2 separate counts in mind at once, without either collapsing into the other. Progress came slowly, and for some volunteers, it did not come at all. A young Khaleesi officer named Torin Vask, easily the fastest recruit in his intake, struggled for weeks with even the simplest exercises, his hands falling back again and again into perfect, unwanted symmetry, no matter how hard he concentrated on keeping them apart. I struggled as well, though perhaps not as badly as Torin. There were nights during those early months when I sat alone in my quarters, tapping two uneven rhythms against the edge of a table, feeling every bit as clumsy and frustrated as the newest recruit I had ever trained. It was a strange and humbling experience, becoming a beginner again after 3 centuries of confident mastery, and I found myself understanding, in a way I never had before, exactly how difficult and disorienting it must feel for a new student to face something that seems, at first, entirely beyond their reach. Mira remained patient throughout those early months, in a way I found both reassuring and quietly instructive in itself. She never seemed frustrated by our slow progress, never treated our repeated failures as evidence that the effort was pointless. She reminded me, more than once, that she herself had not learned this skill overnight either, even if she had never thought of it as learning at all. It had simply accumulated, slowly, across years of ordinary childhood activity, long before anyone had ever asked her to think about it as a skill worth naming. Torin himself nearly withdrew from the project entirely during the 3rd month, frustrated by weeks of visible effort producing no measurable progress. I remember speaking with him privately one evening, much the way Mira had once spoken with me, trying to offer the same patience she had shown during my own early struggles. He told me he had begun to wonder whether some minds were simply built the wrong way for this kind of independence, whether his own species carried some deep, unchangeable limitation that no amount of practice could overcome. I did not have a confident answer for him that night, only the honest admission that I shared many of the same doubts about myself. I asked him only to continue a little longer, not because I could promise him success, but because I genuinely did not yet know where the limit of possibility truly lay, and neither did anyone else in the Concord. By the 4th month, something began to shift, slowly and unevenly, among the volunteers who had stayed with the project. Progress remained far from universal. Some officers, including Torin, continued to struggle badly, their minds seemingly unable to fully release the old familiar habit of treating both hands as a single unified intention. But others, myself included, began to show small, genuine improvements. My own hands, after months of quiet practice, had begun to develop something I can only describe as a rough, imperfect echo of what I had watched Mira do so effortlessly on that first training floor months earlier. A hesitant, uneven independence that felt nothing like true mastery, but felt entirely unlike anything I had been capable of before. The final demonstration, arranged by the Council to mark the formal conclusion of our research project, took place on the very same training floor where this entire story had first begun. I stood at one end, holding 2 practice blades for the first time in front of an audience, while Mira stood at the other, calm and unhurried as always. The assembled officers and researchers watched in the same heavy silence that had filled the hall during her original match, though this time the silence carried a different weight, curiosity rather than disbelief, anticipation rather than certainty. I will not pretend the match that followed was anything close to even. Mira's blades moved with the same effortless independence they always had, each one following its own rhythm, with a calm confidence built from an entire lifetime of ordinary practice I could never fully replicate at my age. My own attempts, by comparison, were slow and uneven, my 2 blades occasionally slipping back into the old, familiar unity I had spent months trying to break apart. I lost the match quickly, though not quite as quickly as Sorel had lost to Mira all those months before, and when it ended, I found myself smiling in a way I rarely allowed myself to smile in front of an audience of senior officers. I had not learned to fight the way Mira fought. I doubted I ever fully would, not after 3 centuries of a mind shaped entirely around the old assumption that 2 hands must always move as one. But I had learned enough, in those difficult months of practice, to understand something important about the nature of the ability itself. It was not magic. It was not a hidden trick of human biology unavailable to every other species in the Concord. It was a foundation, built slowly and quietly through years of ordinary practice, one that could be partially rebuilt later in life through effort and patience, though never as completely or as naturally as it could be built from the very beginning, during the small, unremarkable years of childhood. In the months that followed our final demonstration, the Concord Training Council began the long, careful work of updating combat doctrine across every branch of service, a process that continued well beyond the point where my own involvement in the research officially ended. New training programs were developed for younger recruits, still years away from adulthood, designed around the same simple principles Mira had described to me during our very first conversation: small rhythm games, coordinated exercises, activities meant to gently encourage a young mind toward the kind of independent, two-handed thinking that human children developed naturally without ever realizing they were training for anything at all. Early results from these programs, though still years from full maturity, suggested that other species, when given the chance to develop this ability during their own formative years rather than attempting to build it late in life, showed far more promising progress than any of us adult volunteers ever had. Humanity's place within the Concord shifted quietly but unmistakably during that same period. I remember sitting in on a formal briefing where senior officers debated how best to classify humans within the Concord's military archives, a debate that grew more complicated the longer it continued. They were not simply an unusually gifted species, the way certain individual warriors from other species occasionally proved unusually gifted. They were not the product of any deliberate military tradition, any ancient warrior culture built specifically around combat. They were, as far as anyone could determine, an entire species that had accidentally developed a foundational combat advantage through nothing more remarkable than the ordinary, unremarkable business of growing up, entirely unaware, for the whole of their recorded history, that what they considered simple childhood play quietly prepared them for something every other species in the galaxy had long believed impossible. I think back often to that first quiet meeting with Mira, sitting across from her as she calmly described drums and typing and jump ropes, explaining, without any sense of pride or grand purpose, how she had learned to do the thing that would eventually reshape Concord military doctrine. I remember asking her, near the very end of that first conversation, whether she understood how remarkable what she had done truly was. She had shrugged, the same small, unbothered shrug I had come to know so well over the following months, and told me that she had never really thought about it that way at all. To her, it had simply always been something her hands could do, the same way breathing or walking required no explanation, no pride, no sense of accomplishment beyond the quiet satisfaction of doing something well. I understood then, standing in that final training hall 6 months later, watching a new generation of recruits from a dozen different species begin their own slow, careful practice toward a skill that had once seemed entirely beyond their reach, that the most remarkable thing about humanity was never simply their ability to break a law the rest of the galaxy had accepted without question. It was that they had never known, for the whole of their long and ordinary history, that there had ever been a law to break at all.